On the night of March 19, 1919, every dance hall in New Orleans was packed. Every home with a phonograph played jazz at full volume. People who'd never danced before danced in the streets. Because a serial killer had promised, if you play jazz that night, you'll be spared. If you don't, you might be next. And incredibly, impossibly, it worked. Not a single person was attacked that night. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. A killer who terrorized a city for over a year. Who murdered at least 6 people and wounded dozens more. Who wrote taunting letters to the press. Who vanished without a trace. And who was never, ever caught. Between March 1918 and October 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped by terror. A serial killer was stalking the streets. But this wasn't an ordinary murderer. The Axeman, as he came to be known, followed a horrifying pattern. He would chisel through the back door of homes in the dead of night. He would creep through dark rooms while families slept. He would find an axe, usually the victim's own axe, somewhere on the property. And then he would attack. Striking sleeping victims in their beds. Crushing skulls with savage, powerful blows. Sometimes he killed. Sometimes he left victims barely alive, their faces destroyed, their memories shattered. But here's what makes this case truly bizarre. The Axeman seemed to choose his victims at random. Men, women, young, old, there was no clear pattern. He didn't rob his victims. Money and valuables were left untouched. He didn't sexually assault them. He simply attacked. And then disappeared into the New Orleans night. The police were baffled. Private detectives were hired and made no progress. The public was terrified. And then, in March 1919, the Axeman did something unprecedented. He wrote to the newspapers. Not once, but multiple times. Letters that were part confession, part taunt, part supernatural threat. In one infamous letter, he claimed to be a demon from hell. He said he was invisible. He said no one would ever catch him. And then he made an offer. On March 19, at 12:15 a.m. exactly, he would visit New Orleans. But he would spare any home where jazz music was playing. The entire city responded. Dance halls were packed. Music filled the streets. New Orleans became one massive jazz party. And that night, for the first time in months, the Axeman didn't strike. Coincidence? Or did a serial killer actually keep his word? 6 weeks later, the attacks resumed. More victims. More terror. And then, suddenly, in October 1919, he stopped. The Axeman simply vanished. No more attacks. No more letters. No arrest. Just, gone. To this day, over 100 years later, the identity of the Axeman of New Orleans remains unknown. This is Cold Case Dossier, file number 003. The Axeman of New Orleans. The demon killer who made a city dance. To understand the Axeman, you first need to understand New Orleans in 1918. The city was unlike anywhere else in America. A melting pot of cultures, French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, all blended together in a unique Creole society. It was a city of music, of nightlife, of voodoo and mysticism, of traditions that went back centuries. But in 1918, New Orleans was also a city in crisis. The United States had entered World War I a year earlier. Thousands of young men from Louisiana were fighting in France. The war had created shortages, food, fuel, basic necessities. But even more terrifying than the war was the pandemic. The Spanish flu was sweeping across America, killing millions. New Orleans was hit hard. Hospitals overflowed with the sick and dying. Public gatherings were banned. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. People wore masks when they went outside. The streets that were normally filled with music and celebration were eerily quiet. Death was everywhere. And into this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, the Axeman arrived. The neighborhood of Gretna, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans proper, was home to a large Italian immigrant community. These were working-class families, grocers, laborers, small business owners. They'd come to America seeking a better life. What they found was hard work, prejudice, and now, terror. Because the Axeman's first victims were Italian grocers. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. Let's meet the first confirmed victims. Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Joseph Maggio was 32 years old in May 1918. He ran a small grocery store at the corner of Upperline and Magnolia Streets in the working-class neighborhood of Algiers. The store was on the ground floor. Joseph and his wife Catherine, also 32, lived in the apartment above the shop. Joseph's brothers, Jake and Andrew Maggio, lived next door. The Maggio brothers had immigrated from Sicily in the 1890s. They'd worked hard, saved money, and built modest but respectable lives. Joseph was described as friendly, hard-working, honest. Catherine was quiet, religious, devoted to her husband and their small business. They had no children. They had no known enemies. On the night of May 22, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio went to bed around 10 p.m., as they always did. The store had closed at 8 p.m. They'd cleaned up, counted the day's receipts, about $18, which they placed in the cash box, and retired upstairs. The apartment was small, a bedroom, a sitting room, a tiny kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it was home. Sometime between midnight and 4 a.m., someone entered the Maggio home. The intruder approached from the back alley. Using a chisel, later determined to belong to the Maggios themselves, the intruder carefully removed a panel from the back door. The wooden panel was about 10 inches by 12 inches, just large enough for someone to reach through and unlock the door from inside. The intruder worked quietly, methodically. Once inside, they moved through the dark apartment. They found Joseph's axe, stored in the back shed, used for chopping wood. And then they entered the bedroom where Joseph and Catherine slept. What happened next was savage, brutal, almost incomprehensible. The intruder struck Joseph first. One massive blow to the back of the head, delivered with such force that it fractured his skull. Joseph never woke up. He died almost instantly. Catherine was struck next. She was hit multiple times, face, head, neck, with the axe and possibly another weapon, perhaps a straight razor. Her injuries were horrific. Her throat was cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The attack was frenzied, violent, personal. But here's what's strange. Nothing was stolen. The $18 in the cash box remained untouched. Catherine's jewelry, modest but valuable to the couple, was left on the dresser. The store's inventory was undisturbed. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else. At approximately 4:45 a.m., Andrew Maggio woke to a strange sound. He lived next door to Joseph and Catherine, and he thought he heard groaning coming through the wall. At first, he tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the sound continued, low, pained, disturbing. Andrew got out of bed and walked to Joseph's apartment. The back door was standing open. Andrew called out, "Joseph? Catherine? Are you okay?" No answer. Andrew stepped inside, his heart beginning to race. He called again, "Joseph?" Still nothing. Andrew walked toward the bedroom. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Joseph was lying in bed, motionless, blood covering the pillow and sheets. Catherine was on the floor beside the bed, having apparently crawled or fallen from where she'd been struck. Blood was everywhere, walls, floor, ceiling. Andrew screamed. He ran outside, shouting for help. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Someone called the police. Within minutes, the scene was chaos, police, neighbors, onlookers, all trying to understand what had happened. The police arrived at 5:15 a.m. Officers James Caruso and Thomas Connors were the first on scene. They immediately secured the area and called for detectives. Detective John D'Antonio arrived by 5:45 a.m. He examined the scene carefully. The chiseled back door panel. The axe, left behind, covered in blood. A straight razor, also bloody, found near Catherine's body. The brutality of the attack was unlike anything Detective D'Antonio had seen in his 15 years on the force. "This is madness," he said to Officer Caruso. "Absolute madness." But there was something else. Something that would later seem significant. Written in chalk on the sidewalk about a block from the Maggio home was a message. "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." Police documented this but weren't sure what it meant. Who was Mrs. Tony? Detectives researched and found something disturbing. In 1911, 7 years earlier, there had been 3 similar axe murders in New Orleans. The victims included a woman named Mrs. Tony and her husband. In those cases, the killer had also entered through chiseled door panels. Had also used the victims' own axes. Had also left the homes without stealing anything. Those murders had never been solved. Could this be the same killer, returning after 7 years? Or was this a copycat, someone who knew about the earlier crimes? The investigation into the Maggio murders began immediately. Police interviewed neighbors, family members, business associates. No one had heard anything unusual during the night. No one had seen anyone suspicious in the area. The intruder had been silent, careful, almost ghost-like. Detectives developed several theories. Theory 1, Mafia hit. Joseph Maggio was Italian. In 1918, anti-Italian prejudice was common. Italians were often associated with organized crime, whether fairly or not. Some detectives believed Joseph might have been involved with the Black Hand or other criminal organizations. Perhaps he'd refused to pay protection money. Perhaps he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have. Perhaps this was a hit designed to send a message. But interviews with family and neighbors contradicted this. Joseph had no ties to organized crime. He was a legitimate businessman, well respected in the community. And if this was a mob hit, why kill Catherine? Why the excessive brutality? Why leave money behind? Mob hits were usually quick, efficient, professional. This was chaotic, savage, personal. Theory 2, personal vendetta. Perhaps Joseph had a personal enemy. A business rival. A jealous acquaintance. Someone with a grudge. Detectives investigated Joseph's business dealings, looking for conflicts or disputes. They found nothing. Joseph ran a small grocery store. He extended credit to regular customers. He got along with competitors. He had no lawsuits, no reported conflicts. Everyone liked Joseph, one neighbor told police. He was a good man. Theory 3, robbery gone wrong. Perhaps the intruder had intended to rob the store but was surprised by Joseph and Catherine. Perhaps the violence was an attempt to eliminate witnesses. But this theory didn't hold up either. The $18 in the cash box was easily accessible and untouched. If the goal was robbery, why not just take the money and leave? Why stay and commit such brutal murders? Theory 4, random madman. This was the theory that terrified people most. Perhaps the killer was simply insane. Perhaps there was no motive, no logic, no reason. Perhaps anyone could be next. As the investigation stalled, fear spread through the Italian community. Grocery stores installed better locks. Families slept with weapons nearby. Some people left New Orleans entirely. The Maggio brothers, Andrew and Jake, were briefly considered suspects, as family members often are in murder cases. But their alibis were solid, and there was no evidence linking them to the crime. The police had no clear leads, no strong suspects, no apparent motive. The case remained open but went cold within weeks. And then, on June 28, 1918, just 5 weeks after the Maggio murders, the Axeman struck again. Louis Besumer and Harriet Lowe. At 2 a.m. on June 28, 1918, a baker named John Zenka was walking to work. His bakery opened early, and he was used to being one of the few people on the streets at that hour. As he passed by a grocery store at the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe streets, he noticed something odd. The back door was standing open. Zenka knew the store owner, Louis Besumer, a Polish immigrant who'd been running the grocery for about a year. It was unusual for the door to be open at 2 a.m. Zenka approached cautiously and called out, "Mr. Besumer? Is everything all right?" No answer. Zenka stepped closer and peered inside. He could see that the apartment above the store was dark, but he heard something, a low moaning sound. Alarmed, Zenka ran to find a police officer. Patrolman Peter Cook responded within minutes. Cook entered the building, calling out for Besumer. The moaning continued. Cook climbed the stairs to the apartment above the shop. What he found was another nightmare scene. Louis Besumer, 59 years old, was lying in bed, his head covered in blood. A massive wound gaped open on his skull. He'd been struck with tremendous force. But Besumer was alive, though barely conscious. In the next room, Cook found Harriet Lowe. Harriet, 28, was Besumer's common-law wife, though some neighbors whispered that she was actually his mistress. She too had been struck in the head with an axe. Her injuries were severe but not immediately fatal. Like Besumer, she was alive but gravely wounded. The scene was eerily similar to the Maggio murders. A chiseled back door panel. An axe, Besumer's own axe, left at the scene, covered in blood. No sign of robbery. Money in the store's cash register was untouched. Besumer and Lowe were rushed to Charity Hospital. Doctors worked frantically to save their lives. Both had fractured skulls. Both had lost tremendous amounts of blood. But somehow, against the odds, both survived the initial trauma. Detective D'Antonio, who'd investigated the Maggio case, was called to the scene. He immediately recognized the similarities. "This is the same killer," D'Antonio told his superiors. "Same method. Same brutality. Same lack of theft. But there was a key difference. This time, there were survivors. If Besumer and Lowe recovered enough to talk, they might be able to identify their attacker." D'Antonio waited anxiously for the victims to regain consciousness. After 2 days, Louis Besumer finally woke up. He was confused, disoriented, in tremendous pain. D'Antonio approached his hospital bed carefully. "Mr. Besumer, can you hear me? I'm Detective D'Antonio. Can you tell me what happened?" Besumer's eyes focused slowly. I don't know. Someone hit me. I was sleeping and then, pain. That's all I remember." "Did you see who attacked you?" "No. It was dark. I was sleeping." "Did you hear anything? A voice? Footsteps?" "No. Nothing. Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you?" Besumer shook his head weakly. "No enemies. I run a store. I sell groceries. Why would someone do this?" Harriet Lowe remained unconscious for longer, nearly a week. When she finally woke, her story was different. And much more complicated. "Louis did this," Harriet told police weekly. "Louis attacked me." Detectives were stunned. "Are you saying Louis Besumer attacked you?" "Yes. He's a German spy. He tried to kill me because I found out." This accusation sent the case in a completely different direction. Remember, this was 1918. America was at war with Germany. Anti-German sentiment was intense. Spy hysteria was rampant. Louis Besumer was Polish, not German, but his accent was thick and his origins were from Central Europe. Some neighbors had whispered that Besumer might be a German sympathizer. Could Harriet be telling the truth? Police investigated Besumer's background thoroughly. They found no evidence of German connections or espionage activities. Besumer was simply an immigrant trying to make a living. But Harriet's accusation, made while she was recovering from severe head trauma, cast doubt on everything. Was she telling the truth? Or was her damaged brain creating false memories? After several more days, Harriet changed her story. "I don't remember what happened," she told a different detective. "I don't know why I said Louis did it. I was confused. But the damage was done." Newspapers had reported Harriet's initial accusation. Public opinion turned against Besumer. Some people believed he'd attacked Harriet and then injured himself to make it look like they'd both been victims. Others believed the original theory, that the Axeman had struck again, and Harriet's accusations were the result of brain damage and confusion. The case became murky, controversial, unsolvable. While police debated whether Besumer was victim or perpetrator, the Axeman, if that's who'd attacked them, was still out there. And he wasn't finished. Mrs. Edward Schneider. 8 days after the Besumer attack, on the evening of August 5, 1918, Mrs. Edward Schneider was home alone. Mrs. Schneider, her first name was Anna, though newspapers of the time rarely used women's first names, was pregnant, about 7 months along. Her husband Edward worked nights as a clerk at a local bank and wouldn't be home until morning. Anna went to bed around 10 p.m. in their small home at 2316 Elysian Fields Avenue. She was a light sleeper, especially with her pregnancy making comfort difficult. Sometime after midnight, Anna woke to a presence in the room. She opened her eyes to darkness. But she sensed someone there. Before she could scream, before she could move, something struck her. A massive blow to the head. Then another. And another. Anna lost consciousness. At 6:30 a.m., Edward Schneider arrived home from his night shift. He found the back door of their home standing open, the panel chiseled out, just like the previous attacks. Edward rushed inside, calling for his wife. Anna was lying in bed, covered in blood, unconscious but alive. Edward screamed for help. Neighbors called for an ambulance. Anna was rushed to Charity Hospital, the same hospital where Besumer and Lowe were still recovering. Doctors were horrified by her injuries. She'd been struck at least 3 times in the head with an axe. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. But incredibly, miraculously, Anna survived. Even more miraculous, her baby survived. Anna regained consciousness after 2 days. "Did you see who attacked you?" Detective D'Antonio asked. Anna shook her head weakly. "It was dark. I opened my eyes and someone was there. That's all I remember before the pain." "Can you describe them? Tall? Short? Man? Woman?" "I don't know. Just a shadow." "Did they say anything?" "No. Nothing." Anna's attack confirmed what Detective D'Antonio had feared. The Axeman was real. This wasn't the Besumer case being explained away as domestic violence. This was a serial attacker, targeting victims seemingly at random. 3 attacks in less than 3 months. 3 households invaded in the dead of night. And the police were no closer to catching the perpetrator than they'd been after the first attack. Joseph Romano. Just 3 days after the attack on Anna Schneider, on August 10, 1918, the Axeman struck again. This time, the victim was Joseph Romano, a middle-aged barber who lived with his 2 nieces at 1028 Gravier Street. Romano's nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, ages 18 and 13, were sleeping in the room next to their uncle. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Pauline woke to the sound of scuffling coming from Joseph's room. She heard a groan, then a heavy thud. Alarmed, Pauline shook her younger sister awake. "Mary, wake up. Something's wrong." They heard another sound, footsteps moving quickly through the house. Pauline, terrified but brave, got out of bed and crept toward the doorway. She peered into the hallway. A figure was moving toward the back of the house. It was too dark to see clearly, but Pauline got an impression. A man. Tall. Heavy-set. Wearing dark clothing. The figure reached the back door and disappeared into the night. Pauline ran to Joseph's room. What she found was horrific. Joseph was lying in bed, his head split open, blood soaking the sheets and pillow. He was still breathing, but barely. Pauline screamed. Neighbors came running. Police were called. Joseph Romano was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. Before he died, however, Pauline provided police with the first real description of the Axeman. A tall, heavy-set man in dark clothing. That was it. That was all she could say for certain. She hadn't seen his face. The hallway had been too dark. But it was more than police had before. Detectives showed Pauline photographs of known criminals, hoping she might recognize the build or posture. She couldn't identify anyone. The description was too vague to be truly useful. But it did confirm that the Axeman was likely a man. And he was strong enough to wield an axe with deadly force. After the Romano murder, New Orleans descended into panic. 4 attacks in less than 3 months. 3 confirmed deaths, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, and now Joseph Romano. Multiple survivors with life-altering injuries. And the killer remained at large. Newspapers ran daily stories about the mysterious Axeman. Citizens formed vigilante groups, patrolling neighborhoods at night. Hardware stores sold out of door chains, deadbolts, and locks. Some families boarded up their back doors entirely. Others slept with weapons nearby, guns, knives, clubs. The Italian community was particularly terrified. All of the victims so far had been Italian or of Italian descent. Was the Axeman targeting Italians specifically? Was this some kind of hate crime or vendetta against Italian immigrants? Police Superintendent Frank Mooney addressed these fears in a public statement. "We are investigating all possibilities. The attacks may be targeting the Italian community, or the pattern may be coincidental. We urge all citizens to take precautions, secure your doors, be alert for suspicious activity, and report anything unusual to police immediately." Private detectives were hired by wealthy Italian businessmen to supplement the police investigation. A reward fund was established, $500 for information leading to the Axeman's capture, a substantial sum in 1918. But despite increased patrols, despite hundreds of tips called in, despite the entire city on high alert, the Axeman remained uncaught. And then, suddenly, the attacks stopped. August, September, October, November, December passed without incident. 1918 turned into 1919. January, February passed. No attacks. People began to relax slightly. Maybe the Axeman had left New Orleans. Maybe he'd been arrested for some other crime in another city. Maybe he'd died in the flu pandemic. Or maybe he was just waiting. Watching. Planning his return. On March 13, 1919, nearly 7 months after the last attack, the Times-Picayune newspaper received an envelope. The return address simply said, "Hell." Inside was a letter. A letter that would become one of the most famous documents in true crime history. The letter was written in neat, dramatic handwriting. It read, "Esteemed mortal of New Orleans. They have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15, earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am and will be the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fancy. The Axeman. The letter was immediately shared with police. Superintendent Mooney was furious. This is obviously a hoax, he told reporters. Some sick individual trying to get attention. The real killer doesn't write letters to newspapers. But the public wasn't so sure. The letter's tone, mocking the police, claiming supernatural origins, making specific threats, was deeply unsettling. Whether written by the real Axeman or a copycat, it created panic. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Axeman threatens New Orleans, demands jazz music or death. The date mentioned in the letter, Tuesday, March 19, at 12:15 a.m., was just 6 days away. What would happen on that night? Was this a genuine threat? Should people take it seriously? The city was divided in its response. Some people scoffed, dismissing the letter as a tasteless prank. Others took it deadly seriously, making plans to ensure their homes would be filled with jazz music on the specified night. Dance halls saw a surge in business. The owner of Lala's Cabaret on Murray Street announced that his establishment would remain open all night on March 18 to 19, with live jazz bands playing continuously. If the Axeman truly loves jazz, the owner told reporters, then Lala's will be the safest place in New Orleans. Music stores sold out of jazz records. Phonograph sales skyrocketed. People who'd never played an instrument in their lives bought tin whistles, harmonicas, anything that could produce sound vaguely resembling music. One enterprising music publisher quickly composed a piece called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me Papa, and rushed it into print. The sheet music sold thousands of copies in the days leading up to March 19. Police increased patrols, preparing for the possibility that the letter writer, whether the real Axeman or a hoaxer, might actually attempt attacks that night. Detective D'Antonio told his officers, "I don't believe this letter is real. But we can't take chances. Be extra vigilant on the night of the 19th. As the deadline approached, New Orleans transformed. By the evening of March 18, preparations were in full swing. Families who owned phonographs dusted them off and stacked jazz records nearby. Those who didn't have phonographs borrowed them from neighbors or friends. Musicians who typically played at clubs and dance halls were hired for private parties. The wealthy hosted elaborate soirees with live bands. The working class gathered in their homes, ready to play whatever music they could manage. As midnight approached on March 18, just 15 minutes before the Axeman's promised arrival time of 12:15 a.m. on the 19th, something extraordinary happened. The music started. All across New Orleans, simultaneously, jazz filled the air. From the mansions of the Garden District to the cramped shotgun houses of the working-class neighborhoods, music poured into the streets. When the Saints Go Marching In. St. Louis Blues. Livery Stable Blues. Some bands were skilled professionals. Others were amateurs fumbling through unfamiliar tunes. But everyone played. Dance halls were packed beyond capacity. Lala's Cabaret had lines around the block. The Funky But Hall, the Gypsy Tea Room, the Villa Cabaret, every venue was overflowing. People danced in the streets. Impromptu jazz bands formed on street corners. The sound was cacophonous, joyful, defiant. New Orleans had turned a serial killer's threat into the biggest party the city had ever seen. Newspapers would later describe it as one of the most surreal nights in American history. A city united in music, dancing to save their lives, turning terror into celebration. Detective D'Antonio walked through the French Quarter that night, observing the spectacle. He later wrote in his personal journal, "I've never seen anything like it. The entire city has gone mad, but it's a beautiful madness. If the Axeman truly loves jazz, then tonight New Orleans has given him more than he could ever have asked for." 12:15 a.m. came and went. The music continued. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. 3 a.m. Some parties went until dawn. And that night, March 19, 1919, not a single person in New Orleans was attacked. For the first time since the Axeman's reign of terror began, a night passed without violence, without fear, without bloodshed. The morning of March 19, people woke with hangovers and relief. They'd survived. They'd danced, and they'd lived. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. City dances and Axeman stays away. Jazz music keeps killer at bay. New Orleans defeats the Axeman with rhythm. Superintendent Mooney held a press conference. "Last night proves that the letter was a hoax," he announced. There was no Axeman prowling the streets. It was a prank, and the public fell for it. But many people disagreed. To them, the lack of attacks that night proved the letter was real. The Axeman had made a promise, spare those who play jazz, and he'd kept it. Whether spirit or human, demon or madman, the Axeman had shown he was a killer of his word. The debate raged in newspapers and on street corners. Was the letter genuine? Had the Axeman truly been deterred by music? Or had the whole thing been an elaborate hoax that coincidentally aligned with a period when the killer was inactive anyway? We'll never know for certain. But here's what we do know. The Axeman's letter accomplished something the police couldn't. It united the city. It transformed fear into action. It turned potential victims into celebrants. And it created one of the most bizarre and memorable nights in New Orleans history. But the celebration wouldn't last long. Because the Axeman wasn't finished with New Orleans. Not yet. For 6 weeks after the jazz night, New Orleans remained quiet. People began to relax again. Maybe the Axeman truly had been satisfied with the city's musical tribute. Maybe he'd moved on to another city. Maybe he'd died in the flu pandemic that was still ravaging the country. But on August 10, 1919, exactly 1 year after the Joseph Romano murder, the Axeman returned. Sarah Laumann. Sarah Laumann was a 19-year-old woman who lived alone in a small apartment at 2715 Iberville Street. She worked as a seamstress, a common profession for young single women in 1919. Sarah was independent, hard-working, and well-liked by her neighbors. She had no connection to the previous victims. She wasn't Italian. She didn't run a grocery store. She lived alone. If the Axeman had been targeting Italian grocers, Sarah broke the pattern completely. On the night of August 10, Sarah went to bed around 10 p.m. She lived on the second floor of a small apartment building. Her windows were open, it was a hot August night, and air conditioning didn't exist. Sometime after midnight, the Axeman struck. Unlike previous attacks where he chiseled through back doors, this time he climbed. He scaled the outside of the building and entered through Sarah's open window. He found Sarah sleeping. He struck her with an axe, one massive blow to the head. Sarah woke screaming. Despite her injury, she fought back. She kicked. She scratched. She bit. The Axeman struck her again, but Sarah kept fighting. Her screams woke the entire building. Neighbors came running. Doors opened. Lights turned on. The Axeman fled back through the window, disappearing into the night. Sarah survived, though her injuries were severe. She was rushed to the hospital where she underwent emergency surgery. Doctors managed to save her life, though she would carry the scars, both physical and psychological, forever. When Sarah was finally able to speak to police, she provided a description. A white man. Tall. Heavy build. He wore dark clothes. I couldn't see his face clearly, it was too dark and everything happened so fast. It matched Pauline Bruno's description from the Romano attack. But it was still too vague to be truly useful. The attack on Sarah Laumann reignited panic throughout New Orleans. The Axeman was back. And now it seemed he was targeting anyone, not just Italian grocers. No one was safe. Mike Pepitone. Less than a month later, on September 3, 1919, the Axeman struck for what would be his final confirmed attack. The victim was Mike Pepitone, a 40-year-old grocer who lived with his wife and 6 children at 1207 2nd Street in Gretna. Mike ran a small grocery store, just like Joseph Maggio had. He was Italian, just like most of the previous victims. The attack returned to the original pattern. On the night of September 2, Mike Pepitone went to bed around 10 p.m. His wife, Rosie, slept beside him. Their 6 children, ranging in age from 3 to 15, slept in nearby rooms. Sometime between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the Axeman entered through the back door. Once again, he'd chiseled out a panel, reached through, and unlocked the door from inside. He found Mike's axe in the back shed. He crept through the dark house, past the sleeping children, to the master bedroom. Mike was sleeping on his side. The Axeman struck him in the back of the head. Once. Twice. 3 times. The blows were savage, powerful, delivered with intense force. Rosie woke to the sound of impact, a sickening wet thud. She opened her eyes to see a dark figure standing over her husband, axe raised. Rosie screamed. The scream was primal, terrified, piercing. The Axeman turned toward her. For a moment, one frozen moment, Rosie looked at her husband's killer. She would later say she saw his eyes, though the room was dark. Cold eyes, she told police. Evil eyes. Not human. The Axeman didn't attack Rosie. Instead, he fled. Rosie's screams had woken the children and neighbors. People were emerging from their homes, lights turning on, voices calling out. The Axeman ran through the house and out the back door, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Rosie rushed to Mike's side. He was still alive, but barely. Blood covered the pillow, the sheets, Rosie's nightgown as she held him. Mike! Mike, stay with me. Someone help. Please, someone help us. Neighbors came running. Police were called. An ambulance arrived. But it was too late. Mike Pepitone died before reaching the hospital. He left behind a widow and 6 children, the youngest just 3 years old. The investigation of the Pepitone murder was extensive. Police interviewed Rosie multiple times, trying to get every detail she could remember. Did you see his face? No. It was too dark. Just his eyes. I'll never forget his eyes. Can you describe his build? His height? Tall. Heavy. Strong. He held the axe like it weighed nothing. Did he say anything? No. Not a word. Just silence. Terrible silence. Did Mike have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt him? No. Everyone loved Mike. He was a good man, a good father. He worked hard. He had no enemies. The pattern was unmistakable now. Italian grocers. Chiseled back doors. Axes left at the scene. No robbery. This was the Axeman's work, no question. Police increased patrols in Italian neighborhoods. Families doubled and tripled their security measures. Some Italian grocers closed their businesses entirely, too terrified to continue. Others armed themselves, sleeping with guns under their pillows, determined to shoot the Axeman if he came for them. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling neighborhoods with baseball bats and pistols. The city was on a knife's edge, waiting for the next attack. But it never came. September passed. October. November. December. The new year came, 1920. Still no attacks. Months became a year. The Axeman had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. With the attacks apparently over, police and amateur investigators began developing theories about the Axeman's identity. Who was he? Why did he kill? And where did he go? Let's examine the major theories that emerged. Theory 1, the Mafia executioner. This theory held that the Axeman wasn't a serial killer at all, but rather a mob enforcer. According to this hypothesis, Italian grocers in New Orleans were being extorted by criminal organizations, possibly the Black Hand, a precursor to the modern mafia. Grocers who refused to pay protection money or who cooperated with police were marked for death. The Axeman was actually multiple different hitmen, all using the same method to create the illusion of a single serial killer. The dramatic nature of the attacks, the axe, the brutality, the lack of theft, was designed to send a message to other potential victims: pay us, or this happens to you. Evidence supporting this theory. Most victims were Italian grocers, a demographic that would have been targets for protection rackets. The Black Hand was known to operate in New Orleans during this period. Several victims had reported receiving threatening letters before their attacks, though these letters were different from the famous Jazz letter. The attack stopped after the Pepitone murder, possibly because the intended message had been delivered. Problems with this theory. Not all victims were grocers. Sarah Laumann was a seamstress, Anna Schneider was a housewife. Mob hits are usually quick and professional, these attacks were chaotic and brutal. The Jazz letter doesn't fit the mafia theory at all. Why would hitmen write theatrical letters to newspapers? Police found no evidence of protection rackets targeting these specific victims. The method was too distinctive and theatrical for typical organized crime. Detective D'Antonio investigated this theory thoroughly and ultimately rejected it. This isn't the Black Hand, he told his superiors. This is something else. Something stranger. Theory 2, the supernatural explanation. Many people in New Orleans, particularly in the poorer, more superstitious neighborhoods, believed the Axeman was exactly what his letter claimed, a demon from hell. New Orleans in 1919 was a city where voodoo, folk magic, and supernatural beliefs were common. Stories circulated about people who'd seen the Axeman. One woman claimed she'd woken to find a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, but when she screamed and turned on the light, the figure vanished, like smoke. A man reported seeing glowing red eyes looking through his window one night, but when he grabbed his gun and ran outside, nothing was there. Voodoo practitioners offered their services, claiming they could ward off the Axeman with spells and charms. Some people hung garlic, crosses, or gree-gree bags above their doors. Churches saw increased attendance as people prayed for protection. The Jazz Letter, with its references to devils in the nether regions and Tartarus, seemed to support the supernatural theory. Was the Axeman truly a spirit? A demon? Something beyond human understanding? Problems with this theory. Physical evidence, chiseled doors, bloody axes, footprints, proved a physical being committed the crimes. Supernatural entities don't typically need to chisel through doors. The attacks showed clear patterns of human behavior and planning. Several victims survived and described seeing a human figure, not a spirit. While the supernatural explanation was popular with the public, it was never seriously considered by law enforcement. Theory 3, the deranged serial killer. This was the theory most investigators eventually settled on. According to this hypothesis, the Axeman was a single individual, a serial killer driven by psychological compulsion. He likely suffered from a severe mental illness, perhaps psychosis, schizophrenia, or a personality disorder. He may have believed he was carrying out a divine mission, or acting on orders from voices only he could hear. The choice of victims wasn't entirely random, but rather based on criteria that made sense only to the killer's disordered mind. The theatrical elements, the jazz letter, the dramatic exits, the use of the victim's own axes, reflected a personality that craved attention and wanted to taunt authorities. Evidence supporting this theory. The attacks showed clear signatures that suggested a single perpetrator: the chiseled doors, the use of victims' own axes, the nighttime timing, the brutality. The jazz letter showed intelligence, literacy, and a theatrical personality. The ability to evade capture despite intense police scrutiny suggested someone clever and careful. The sudden stop in October 1919 could indicate the killer died, was institutionalized, or moved away. Problems with this theory. Why did the attack stop so suddenly in 1919? Why were there gaps of several months between some attacks? How did one person evade capture so completely when the entire city was on alert? Despite the questions, most modern criminologists believe this theory is correct. The Axeman was likely a serial killer, operating alone, driven by psychological compulsion. Theory 4, the war veteran theory. One particularly interesting theory emerged in the 1920s. The Axeman might have been a World War I veteran suffering from what we now call PTSD. In 1918 to 1919, thousands of soldiers were returning from the horrific battlefields of France. Many had witnessed unspeakable violence. Many had killed enemy soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Some returned deeply traumatized, their minds broken by the horrors of war. Could the Axeman have been one of these traumatized veterans? Perhaps someone who'd been taught to kill with axes, clubs, and trench tools during the war? Someone who continued killing when he returned home, unable to turn off the violence? Evidence supporting this theory. The timing aligns. Attacks began in 1918 as soldiers were returning from Europe. The brutality and efficiency of the attacks suggest someone trained in violence. The physical strength required to wield an axe with such deadly force suggests someone in peak physical condition, like a soldier. The attack stopped in 1919, possibly when the killer was able to reintegrate into society or was institutionalized. Problems with this theory. No specific veteran was ever identified as a suspect. The theatrical elements, the jazz letter, don't fit the profile of a PTSD-stricken soldier. The targeting of Italian grocers doesn't connect to war trauma. The careful planning and evasion suggest more than just uncontrolled violence. Specific suspects. Over the years, several specific individuals were suspected of being the Axeman. Suspect number 1, Joseph Mumfre. This is perhaps the most famous suspect, and the one many people believe was the real Axeman. Joseph Mumfre, also spelled Mumfre or Mumfre in some records, was a criminal with a long record of burglary and assault. In December 1920, over a year after the last Axeman attack, a woman named Esther Albano shot and killed a man on a street corner in Los Angeles. The man was Joseph Mumfre. When police arrested Esther, she made a shocking claim. "That man killed my husband. He was the Axeman of New Orleans." Esther had been married to Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's final victim. After Mike's death, Esther had taken her children and left New Orleans, moving to Los Angeles to start over. But she'd never forgotten the night her husband was murdered. She'd never forgotten seeing the killer's eyes in the darkness. According to Esther's story, she'd spent over a year searching for her husband's killer. She'd followed leads, tracked rumors, investigated connections to New Orleans criminals. Eventually, her search led her to Joseph Mumfre, who was living in Los Angeles under an assumed name. Esther stalked Mumfre for several days, confirming it was him. Then, on December 7, 1920, she approached him on the street and shot him 4 times. When police investigated Mumfre's background, they found something interesting. Mumfre had been in New Orleans during the period of the Axeman attacks. He'd been in jail, serving time for burglary, from September 1918 to March 1919. This overlapped perfectly with the gap in Axeman attacks during that period. Mumfre was released from jail in March 1919, and the attacks resumed shortly after. After the Pepitone murder in September 1919, Mumfre left New Orleans and moved to Los Angeles. The Axeman attacks stopped. Was this coincidence? Or was Mumfre the Axeman? Evidence supporting Mumfre as the Axeman. His jail time coincides with the gap in attacks. He left New Orleans immediately after the Pepitone murder. Esther Pepitone identified him as her husband's killer. He had a criminal background that included violence. Problems with Mumfre as the Axeman. Esther's identification could have been driven by grief and a need for revenge, not accurate memory. No physical evidence linked Mumfre to any of the crime scenes. His burglary record doesn't suggest the kind of theatrical personality that wrote the jazz letter. He was never formally charged or tried as the Axeman. Esther Pepitone was tried for murder. Her defense argued she'd killed her husband's murderer and should be shown mercy. The jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before finding her guilty of murder. But they recommended leniency. Esther was sentenced to 10 years in prison but served only 3 years before being paroled. She returned to New Orleans and lived quietly until her death in 1944. To her dying day, Esther maintained that Joseph Mumfre was the Axeman. Many people believe her. But we'll never know for certain if she killed the right man. Suspect number 2, Frank "Doc" Mumford. A completely different suspect named Frank Mumford, note the similar surname to Mumfre, was investigated in the 1940s. Mumford was a violent criminal who'd been active in New Orleans during the 1910s to 1920s. He'd been arrested multiple times for assault, attempted murder, and other violent crimes. In 1947, Mumford was convicted of murdering a woman in New Orleans. While in prison, he allegedly confessed to a cellmate that he'd been responsible for multiple murders in New Orleans, including those grocers everyone thought was killed by the Axeman. The cellmate reported this to authorities, who investigated. But Mumford's confession was never confirmed, and he later recanted. He died in prison in 1951, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. Suspect number 3, Dr. Paul Marion Lezen. One of the more bizarre suspect theories involved Dr. Paul Marion Lezen, a doctor who'd been active in New Orleans during the Axeman period. In 1928, Dr. Lezen was arrested for poisoning several patients. He was eventually convicted and sent to prison. While in prison, Lezen allegedly told other inmates that he'd committed murders, with more than just poison. Some investigators wondered if Lezen could have been the Axeman, using his medical knowledge to target victims in their sleep. But there was never any evidence linking Lezen to the Axeman crimes, and the theory was mostly speculation. Suspect number 4, the unknown victim of the flu. One theory suggests the Axeman was never caught because he died. The Spanish flu pandemic was raging during 1918 to 1919, killing tens of thousands of people in Louisiana alone. Perhaps the Axeman contracted the flu and died, which would explain why the attack stopped so suddenly. If he died without family or was buried in an unmarked grave, his identity would have been lost forever. This theory is impossible to prove or disprove. But it's plausible. The police investigation into the Axeman murders was extensive but ultimately unsuccessful. Let's examine how law enforcement approached this case and why they failed to catch the killer. The investigative team. Detective John D'Antonio was the lead investigator on most of the Axeman cases. D'Antonio was a 20-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department, respected for his thoroughness and intelligence. He was assisted by a team of detectives including Detective Louis Persich, Detective Theodore Obitz, Detective Andrew Glynn. Superintendent Frank Mooney oversaw the entire investigation and regularly briefed the press on developments. The methods. Police employed several investigative techniques. 1. Crime scene analysis. Detectives carefully documented each crime scene, noting the point of entry, always chiseled back doors, with one exception. The weapon used, always axes belonging to the victims. The location of bloodstains, footprints, and other evidence. Any items disturbed or stolen, which was rare. They photographed scenes and collected physical evidence when possible. But forensic science in 1918 to 1919 was primitive compared to modern standards. There was no DNA testing, no fiber analysis, no sophisticated blood typing. Fingerprinting existed but was still relatively new and not always effective. 2. Witness interviews. Police interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Neighbors who might have seen or heard something. Family members of victims. Business associates who might know of enemies or conflicts. Previous arrest records were checked for anyone with a history of violence or mental illness. The problem: most attacks happened in the dead of night when everyone was asleep. Neighbors rarely saw or heard anything useful. 3. Pattern analysis. Detectives looked for patterns in the attacks. Geographic: most attacks occurred in lower-income, predominantly Italian neighborhoods. Temporal: attacks typically happened between midnight and 4 a.m. Victimology: most, but not all, victims were Italian grocers. Method: chiseled back doors, victims' own axes, no theft. The patterns were clear, but they didn't lead to a suspect. 4. Undercover operations. After the Jazz letter was published, police deployed undercover officers to patrol Italian neighborhoods. They staked out grocery stores, hoping to catch the Axeman in the act. They followed suspicious individuals and investigated anyone reported as acting strangely. But the Axeman was too careful, too clever, or too lucky. He was never caught in the act or even spotted by undercover officers. 5. Public appeals. Police regularly appealed to the public for information. Superintendent Mooney held press conferences, asking anyone with knowledge to come forward. Reward money was offered, eventually reaching $1,000, a substantial sum in 1919. Hundreds of tips came in, but most were dead ends. People reporting suspicious neighbors who turned out to be innocent. Supposed psychic visions that provided no useful information. Theories and speculation with no evidence. The challenges. The investigation faced numerous obstacles. 1. Resource limitations. The New Orleans Police Department in 1918 to 1919 was understaffed and underfunded. World War I had depleted manpower as officers were drafted into military service. The flu pandemic further strained resources as officers got sick or had to care for ill family members. 2. Lack of forensic technology. Without modern forensic tools, physical evidence was limited in usefulness. Bloody footprints were found at several scenes, but with no fingerprint database to compare them to, they were nearly useless. Bloodstains were analyzed but couldn't provide the kind of detailed information modern DNA testing can. 3. Public panic. The intense public fear sometimes hindered the investigation. False reports flooded the police, wasting valuable time and resources. Vigilante groups occasionally interfered with police work, contaminating crime scenes or harassing innocent people. 4. Media interference. Newspapers sensationalized the case, sometimes printing rumors or speculation as fact. This created false leads and made it harder for police to control the narrative. The Jazz letter, whether genuine or a hoax, became a media circus that distracted from the actual investigation. 5. The killer's skill. The Axeman was careful, methodical, and left few clues. He used weapons found at the scene, so there was no way to trace where he obtained them. He seemingly chose victims at random or based on criteria police couldn't decipher. He struck quickly and disappeared without being seen. His pattern was consistent enough to confirm he was a serial killer, but unpredictable enough to make anticipating his next move impossible. The failures. Looking back, several investigative failures are apparent. 1. Insufficient crime scene preservation. In several cases, crime scenes were contaminated before they could be properly examined. Family members, neighbors, or even responding officers sometimes disturbed evidence before detectives arrived. 2. Poor communication. Early attacks weren't immediately connected because different detectives handled different cases. It took several murders before police realized they were dealing with a serial killer rather than separate incidents. 3. Tunnel vision. Police initially focused heavily on the theory that the killer was targeting Italian grocers specifically. This may have caused them to overlook other leads or suspect profiles. 4. No psychological profiling. The field of criminal profiling didn't exist in 1919. Police had no framework for understanding serial killers because the concept barely existed. They approached the Axeman as if he were a typical criminal with typical motives, which he clearly was not. 5. Inadequate follow-up. Some leads weren't pursued thoroughly enough. For example, the similarity to the 1911 Axe murders wasn't investigated deeply. Could those earlier crimes and the Axeman attacks have been committed by the same person? Police noted the connection but never fully explored it. Private investigators. Several private detectives were hired by wealthy victims or concerned citizens. One of the most prominent was Frank T. Mooney, no relation to Superintendent Mooney, a former police detective turned private investigator. Frank Mooney developed his own theory: the Axeman was a madman who'd been released from an asylum before the attacks began. He investigated patients released from Louisiana mental institutions between 1916 and 1918. He identified several potential suspects but couldn't prove any of them were the Axeman. Another private investigator, John D'Antone, note the similar name to Detective D'Antonio, believed the Axeman was a member of the Black Hand. He infiltrated Italian criminal organizations, trying to uncover connections to the murders. He found evidence of protection rackets and extortion, but nothing linking these activities to the Axeman specifically. Despite spending months and thousands of dollars, private investigators were no more successful than the police. The press. Newspapers played a major role in the Axeman case, for better and worse. The Times-Picayune, the Daily States, and the New Orleans Item competed to provide the most dramatic coverage. Headlines grew increasingly sensational. Axeman claims another victim. City gripped by fear as killer remains at large. Is the Axeman a demon from hell? The Jazz letter was published in full by multiple papers, despite police requesting they not do so. Newspapers argued the public had a right to know. The publication created both panic and action, leading to the famous Jazz Night but also generating numerous false leads and hoaxes. Crime reporter James Colton of the Times-Picayune became the unofficial chronicler of the Axeman case. He attended crime scenes, interviewed victims' families, and developed his own theories. Colton believed the Axeman was a lunatic with superhuman strength and animal cunning. He wrote dozens of articles analyzing the case, some insightful, others purely speculative. His coverage kept the case in the public consciousness but also contributed to the mythology and fear surrounding the Axeman. The aftermath. After the attack stopped in October 1919, the investigation gradually wound down. Without new attacks, there were no new leads to pursue. Detective D'Antonio continued working the case periodically until his retirement in 1928. He never stopped believing the case could be solved. In his retirement, he maintained a personal file on the Axeman, reviewing evidence and hoping for a breakthrough. When Esther Pepitone killed Joseph Mumfre in 1920, D'Antonio traveled to Los Angeles to investigate. He interviewed Esther extensively and examined Mumfre's criminal record. In the end, D'Antonio believed Mumfre was probably the Axeman, though he acknowledged the evidence was circumstantial. In a 1935 interview shortly before his death, D'Antonio reflected on the case. The Axeman was the most frustrating case of my career. We had multiple crime scenes, multiple witnesses, massive public attention, and still couldn't catch him. He was smart, careful, and either very lucky or very skilled. I believe he was Joseph Mumfre, but I'll go to my grave not knowing for certain. The New Orleans Police Department officially closed the Axeman investigation in 1942. The case remains unsolved to this day. The Axeman of New Orleans left a lasting impact that extended far beyond his victims and their families. Cultural impact. The Axeman influenced New Orleans culture in several ways. 1. Jazz. The jazz letter and the famous March 19th jazz night became part of New Orleans folklore. The song, The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, became a local hit and is still occasionally performed by traditional jazz bands. Some jazz historians argue the Axeman incident helped solidify jazz's place in New Orleans culture. The idea that jazz music could literally save your life, however absurd, gave the music an almost supernatural power in people's minds. 2. True crime. The Axeman case was one of the first serial killer cases to receive extensive national media coverage. It helped establish many of the tropes we now associate with serial killer stories. The mysterious killer with a bizarre pattern. The taunting letters to newspapers. The bumbling police unable to catch the criminal. The city living in fear. Decades later, the Zodiac killer would employ similar tactics, writing cryptic letters to newspapers and taunting police. The Golden State Killer, the BTK Killer, and others would follow similar patterns. The Axeman was a precursor to the modern true crime phenomenon. 3. Folklore. In New Orleans, the Axeman became a legend, a boogeyman used to frighten children and add to the city's mystique. Be good or the Axeman will get you became a common threat parents used with misbehaving children. Ghost tours in New Orleans often include stops at former Axeman crime scenes, with guides telling embellished versions of the story. Some claim the Axeman's spirit still haunts the French Quarter, searching for new victims. 4. Literature and media. The Axeman has inspired numerous works. The 2019 historical novel, The Axeman's Jazz, by Ray Celestin. Multiple episodes of television shows, including American Horror Story. Documentaries and true crime podcasts. Academic papers on serial killers and criminal psychology. Impact on victims' families. The Axeman's attacks destroyed multiple families. The Maggio family never recovered from the double murder of Joseph and Catherine. Andrew and Jake Maggio sold their businesses and left New Orleans, unable to live in the city where their brother was murdered. Mike Pepitone's 6 children grew up without a father. His youngest, just 3 years old when Mike was killed, had no memories of him. Rosie Pepitone never remarried. She raised her children alone, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She died in 1944, still haunted by the memory of watching her husband murdered before her eyes. Anna Schneider survived her attack but suffered permanent injuries. She had chronic headaches for the rest of her life. Her baby, born healthy despite the attack, grew up knowing her mother had nearly died before she was born. Sarah Laumann also survived but was left with facial scarring and psychological trauma. She never married, living quietly and avoiding public attention. She died in 1966 at age 66. The survivors rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. The memories were too painful, too traumatic. Impact on law enforcement. The Axeman case exposed serious weaknesses in early 20th century policing. Lack of coordination between different police units. Primitive forensic capabilities. No framework for understanding or tracking serial killers. Poor evidence preservation and crime scene management. These failures led to reforms in the New Orleans Police Department. Better training in evidence collection and crime scene preservation. Improved communication between detectives working different cases. Creation of a centralized database of violent crimes to help identify patterns. While these improvements came too late to catch the Axeman, they helped solve future cases. The unsolved mystery. More than 100 years later, the Axeman case remains unsolved. We don't know for certain who the killer was. We don't know why he chose his victims. We don't know why he wrote the jazz letter. We don't know why the attacks suddenly stopped. Various theories have been proposed. Joseph Mumfre was the Axeman, and Esther Pepitone's revenge ended his reign of terror. The Axeman died in the flu pandemic. The Axeman left New Orleans and continued killing elsewhere under a different MO. The Axeman was arrested or institutionalized for an unrelated crime. The Axeman simply stopped, either through willpower or because his compulsion faded. We'll probably never know the truth. The case is too old. The evidence has been lost or destroyed. The witnesses are all dead. But the mystery endures. And perhaps that's fitting. New Orleans has always been a city of mysteries, voodoo, ghosts, legends. The Axeman fits perfectly into that tradition. A killer who appeared from nowhere, terrorized the city, made an entire population dance to save their lives, and then vanished without a trace. It's the kind of story that feels like it couldn't possibly be real. But it is real. The victims were real. Their families' suffering was real. The fear that gripped New Orleans was real. And somewhere, lost to history, the identity of the Axeman remains hidden. Looking at the Axeman case through the lens of modern criminal psychology reveals fascinating insights. Let's compare the Axeman to other famous serial killers and analyze what we can learn from the similarities and differences. The Zodiac Killer, 1968 to 1974. The most obvious comparison is to the Zodiac Killer, who terrorized Northern California 50 years after the Axeman. The similarities are striking. 1. Taunting letters. Both killers sent letters to newspapers, taunting police and claiming superiority. The Zodiac's letters included ciphers and demanded they be published on the front page. The Axeman's jazz letter demanded publication and included theatrical claims about being a demon. Both killers seemed to crave attention and enjoyed the game of cat and mouse with authorities. 2. Public theater. Both killers turned their crimes into public spectacles. The Zodiac sent ciphers that newspapers and amateur sleuths tried to decode. The Axeman's jazz night turned an entire city into participants in his drama. Both understood the power of media and used it to amplify their terror. 3. Never caught. Despite massive investigations and extensive media coverage, both killers were never definitively identified or captured. The Zodiac case remains officially unsolved, though a suspect was recently identified through genetic genealogy. The identification is disputed. The Axeman was never identified at all, though Joseph Mumfre is the prime suspect. 4. Mysterious cessation. Both killers suddenly stopped their confirmed attacks. The Zodiac's confirmed murders ended in 1969, though he continued sending letters until 1974. The Axeman's attacks ended in October 1919. Neither was caught, imprisoned, or, as far as we know, died at the time their crimes ended. They simply stopped. Differences. The Zodiac targeted couples in isolated areas, while the Axeman targeted people in their homes. The Zodiac used guns and knives, the Axeman used axes. The Zodiac's letters were more cryptic and puzzle-like, the Axeman's letter was more theatrical and dramatic. BTK Killer, Dennis Rader, 1974–1991. Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill, also shares characteristics with the Axeman. 1. Home invasions. Both entered victims' homes and attacked them in their private spaces. This creates a particular type of terror, the violation of the home, the place people should feel safest. 2. Taunting authorities. Both sent communications to police and media. Rader sent letters, packages, and even a floppy disk that ultimately led to his capture. The Axeman sent at least one letter, possibly more. Some historians believe there were additional letters that weren't published. 3. Long gaps between crimes. Rader had years-long gaps between his murders. The Axeman had months-long gaps between attacks. Both demonstrated that serial killers don't always operate on a consistent, predictable schedule. Differences. Rader was motivated by sexual sadism, the Axeman showed no signs of sexual motivation. Rader was caught when he became overconfident and made a technical error. The Axeman was never caught at all. Jack the Ripper, 1888. The Axeman is sometimes compared to Jack the Ripper, though the cases are quite different. Similarities. Both terrorized major cities, London and New Orleans. Both targeted victims from specific demographics initially, prostitutes for the Ripper, Italian grocers for the Axeman. Both wrote letters to newspapers, though some of the Ripper letters are believed to be hoaxes. Both were never caught. Both became legendary figures in their cities' histories. Differences. The Ripper's murders were more sexually motivated. The Ripper killed outdoors in public spaces, the Axeman invaded homes. The Ripper's victims were all women, the Axeman targeted both men and women. The Ripper's murders were clustered in a few months, the Axeman operated over nearly 2 years. What modern profiling tells us. If the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit existed in 1919, how would they have profiled the Axeman? Based on modern criminal profiling techniques, we can construct a likely profile. Demographics. Male, statistically overwhelming likelihood, given the physical strength required. Age, 25 to 40, serial killers typically start in their 20s or 30s. Race, likely white, most serial killers attack within their own racial group, and all confirmed victims were white. Physical condition, strong, fit, wielding an axe with deadly force requires significant upper body strength. Background. Possibly local to New Orleans or very familiar with the area, knew the neighborhood layouts, back alleys, escape routes. Likely worked a job that didn't require strict 9-to-5 attendance, could operate at night. Possibly lived alone, hard to hide blood-stained clothes and nocturnal activities from family. May have had military experience, the attacks showed planning, discipline, and tactical thinking. Psychology. Organized offender, careful planning, brought tools, left few clues. High intelligence, evaded capture despite massive manhunt. Grandiose personality, the theatrical letter suggests ego and desire for recognition. Possible psychotic features, belief he was a demon, if genuine, suggests delusional thinking. Control-driven, the attacks were about power and control, not theft or sexual gratification. The attacks. Likely scouted targets in advance, knew which homes had back doors, where axes were stored. Comfortable working in darkness, all attacks occurred at night. Willing to take risks, attacking in populated neighborhoods where noise could alert others. Adaptive, changed method with Sarah Laumann, climbing instead of chiseling. Why he wasn't caught. Modern profilers would note several factors that helped the Axeman evade capture. 1. Technological limitations: no DNA evidence, limited fingerprinting, no surveillance cameras, no computer databases. Even if police found hair or fiber evidence, they had no way to analyze it meaningfully. 2. Communication limitations: no way to quickly share information between police departments. If the Axeman moved to another city and continued killing with a different method, nobody would connect the crimes. 3. Psychological understanding limitations: police in 1919 didn't understand serial killers. The term serial killer wouldn't be coined until the 1970s. They treated the Axeman like a typical criminal with rational motives, which he wasn't. 4. The killer's skill: the Axeman was careful, patient, and disciplined. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't make obvious mistakes. Even today, with all our technology, organized serial killers can evade capture for years. In 1919, it was even easier. Modern techniques that would have helped. If this case occurred today, several modern techniques would likely lead to the killer's identification. 1. DNA analysis: blood at crime scenes could be tested. Even if the killer wore gloves, he likely shed hair or skin cells. A DNA profile could be constructed and compared to databases of known offenders. Genetic genealogy, like what caught the Golden State Killer, could identify the killer through family members. 2. Security cameras: modern surveillance would have captured the killer approaching or leaving crime scenes. Facial recognition could scan footage from multiple cameras, tracking movements. 3. Digital footprints: cell phone records would show who was in the area during attacks. Internet history might reveal research into the crime scenes or victims. Social media could provide behavioral evidence. 4. Geographic profiling: computer analysis of crime scene locations could narrow down where the killer likely lived or worked. This technique has successfully identified many serial offenders. 5. Criminal databases: modern databases track violent offenders across jurisdictions. If the killer had any prior arrests, even minor ones, he'd be in the system. Cross-referencing people with connections to multiple crime scenes would flag suspects. 6. Forensic psychology: modern profilers could provide detailed personality profiles. They could predict likely next targets and help focus the investigation. 7. Coordination: modern task forces bring together multiple agencies. FBI, local police, and state investigators would work together seamlessly. Information would be shared instantly. The harsh truth. Despite all these advantages, modern serial killers still sometimes evade capture. The Golden State Killer wasn't caught until 2018, 40 years after his crimes. The Zodiac Killer has never been definitively identified. The Long Island serial killer remains unidentified. So even with modern technology, the Axeman might still have evaded capture if he were operating today. Because ultimately, if a serial killer is careful enough, disciplined enough, and lucky enough, they can disappear into the population. Which is a terrifying thought. It's easy to focus on the mystery of the Axeman's identity and forget the most important aspect of this case. The victims. Real people with real lives, real families, real futures that were stolen from them. Let's take a moment to remember them properly. Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Joseph Maggio was 32 when he died. He'd been married to Catherine for 8 years. They had no children, but Joseph's brothers said they'd been hoping to start a family soon. Joseph was known in the neighborhood as generous. He extended credit to families struggling financially, often forgiving debts when he knew people couldn't pay. Joseph never turned anyone away hungry, one neighbor recalled. If you needed food and couldn't pay, he'd give it to you anyway. Catherine was quiet and religious. She attended Mass daily at St. Mary's Assumption Church. She volunteered with the church's charity programs, helping feed the poor. Friends described her as kind, gentle, devoted to her husband. The Maggios were planning to expand their grocery store. Joseph had been saving money to buy the adjacent property and open a larger market. Those dreams died with them on May 23, 1918. Joseph's brothers, Andrew and Jake, were devastated. They'd immigrated from Sicily together, supported each other, built their lives together. Andrew never recovered from finding his brother and sister-in-law murdered. He suffered from what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, inability to sleep. He sold his business within a year and left New Orleans, never to return. Jake stayed in the city but struggled with alcoholism and depression. He died in 1931, still haunted by his brother's murder. Louis Besumer and Harriet Lowe. Louis Besumer survived his attack but his life was destroyed. After Harriet accused him of being a German spy and attacking her, public opinion turned against him. His grocery store was vandalized. Customers stopped shopping there. He was arrested based on Harriet's accusation and spent months in jail awaiting trial. Even after Harriet recanted and Louis was acquitted, the damage was done. His reputation was ruined. His business failed. Louis left New Orleans in 1920, broken and bitter. He died in 1941 in Texas, alone and largely forgotten. Harriet Lowe's fate was even more tragic. She survived the physical attack but her brain injuries caused permanent cognitive damage. She suffered from severe headaches, memory problems, and personality changes. In August 1919, just over a year after the attack, Harriet died. The official cause was listed as complications from previous head trauma. Essentially, the Axeman's attack killed her, just slowly. She was 29 years old. She left behind no family, she'd been estranged from her relatives before meeting Louis. She was buried in a pauper's grave in New Orleans. Anna Schneider. Anna Schneider survived her attack and gave birth to a healthy baby girl 2 months later, in October 1918. She named the baby Rose, after her mother. Anna's physical recovery was remarkable, doctors called her survival miraculous. But the psychological scars never healed. Anna suffered from severe anxiety and depression. She was terrified of sleeping, fearing another attack. For years, she slept with the lights on and a gun under her pillow. Her husband Edward did his best to support her, but the trauma affected their marriage. They stayed together but friends said the joy had gone out of their relationship. Anna rarely smiled. She rarely left the house. She was constantly vigilant, constantly afraid. Anna died in 1952 at age 60. Her daughter Rose said her mother had lived 34 years since the attack, but she'd never really lived. The Axeman took something from my mother that night, Rose said. Not just her security, but her ability to be happy. She survived, but she didn't really live. Joseph Romano. Joseph Romano was 42 when he was murdered. He was a barber who ran a small shop in addition to his apartment. He'd never married but was close with his nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, who lived with him. Joseph had essentially raised the girls after their parents died in a house fire when they were young children. He worked long hours to provide for them, ensuring they had food, clothes, and education. Uncle Joseph sacrificed everything for us, Pauline said years later. He could have married, could have had his own life. But he chose to raise us instead. Joseph was planning to see Pauline married, she'd recently gotten engaged to a local man. He was excited about the wedding, had been saving money to help pay for it. He never got to see it. After Joseph's murder, Pauline and Mary were left without a guardian. They moved in with distant relatives who treated them more like servants than family. Pauline married young, partially to escape that situation. Mary struggled with poverty for years. Both women carried guilt for the rest of their lives, guilt that their uncle had died protecting them, guilt that they'd survived while he hadn't. I heard the sounds that night and I didn't act faster, Pauline said in a 1960 interview, 42 years after the attack. Maybe if I'd gone to his room sooner, maybe if I'd screamed louder, maybe he'd have survived. Pauline died in 1968. In her will, she left money for a new headstone for Joseph's grave. The headstone reads, Joseph Romano, 1876–1918. Loving uncle. Devoted guardian. Murdered by evil. Never forgotten. Sarah Laumann. Sarah Laumann was only 19 when she was attacked. She survived, but her face was permanently scarred from the axe blows. In an era before modern plastic surgery, the scars were severe and disfiguring. Sarah became a recluse. She rarely left her apartment. She avoided mirrors. She worked from home as a seamstress, one of the few jobs that didn't require public interaction. She never married, never had children. Friends who knew her before the attack said she'd been vivacious, outgoing, full of life. After the attack, she was withdrawn, quiet, haunted. The Sarah we knew died that night, one friend said. The woman who survived was someone different. Sarah died in 1966 at age 66. She lived 47 years after the attack, 47 years of solitude and fear. Her obituary was 3 lines long. She'd lived such a quiet life that there was almost nothing to say about her. But before the Axeman, Sarah had dreams. She wanted to open her own dress shop. She wanted to get married and have children. She wanted to travel, to see Paris and Rome. The Axeman took all of that away in one moment of violence. Mike Pepitone. Mike Pepitone was 40 when he was murdered. He left behind his wife Rosie and 6 children. Michaela, age 15. Angelo, age 13. Giuseppe, age 11. Maria, age 8. Rosa, age 5. Antonio, age 3. Mike had been a devoted father. Despite working long hours at his grocery store, he always made time for his children. He helped with homework. He told stories. He played games. His children adored him. Papa was the best man I ever knew, Michaela said years later. He worked so hard for us. He never complained. He just loved us. After Mike's death, the family struggled terribly. Rosie had to work multiple jobs to support the children. The older children dropped out of school to work and help support their younger siblings. They lost the grocery store, Rosie couldn't run it alone. They moved to a smaller, cheaper apartment. Poverty became a constant companion. But worse than the poverty was the absence. Christmas without Papa. Birthdays without Papa. Graduations without Papa. Antonio, the youngest, had no real memories of his father. He knew Mike only through stories and photographs. I look at his picture and try to remember, Antonio said in a 1975 interview. But I was so young. I remember a feeling safe, feeling loved. But I don't remember him. And that haunts me. Michaela never married. She devoted her life to helping raise her younger siblings. Angelo became a police officer, driven by a desire to catch criminals like the one who'd killed his father. Giuseppe struggled with alcoholism and died young, at age 42, the same age his father had been when murdered. Maria became a nun, finding solace in religious devotion. Rosa married and had children but suffered from severe anxiety and depression. Antonio became a lawyer and spent years trying to get the Axeman case reopened. He died in 2003, still seeking justice for his father. Rosie never remarried. She wore black, the traditional Italian widow's mourning, for the rest of her life. She died in 1944, 25 years after Mike's murder. Her children said she never recovered from that night. Mama saw Papa murdered, Rosa said. She watched him die and couldn't stop it. That broke something inside her. She survived, but she was never whole again. The unconfirmed victims. Several other attacks during 1918 to 1919 were possibly connected to the Axeman but never officially attributed to him. In June 1918, a grocer named John Aloisio was attacked in his home with an axe. He survived and described his attacker as a tall, heavy man in dark clothes. Police investigated but couldn't definitively link it to the Axeman. In March 1919, shortly before the jazz letter was published, a woman named Irlando Giordano and her daughter were attacked. Both survived. The attack bore some similarities to the Axeman's pattern but had differences too. If these were Axeman victims, the total victimology is even larger than official records show. The forgotten impact. Beyond the direct victims, hundreds of other people were affected. Police officers who worked the case carried the weight of failure, they couldn't catch the killer. Neighbors of victims lived with fear and trauma. The Italian community in New Orleans faced increased prejudice and suspicion. Families throughout the city changed their routines, installed locks, armed themselves. The city's sense of safety was shattered. The Axeman's true victim count isn't just the people he attacked. It's everyone whose life was touched by his terror. The Axeman's jazz letter deserves deeper examination. It's one of the most unusual documents in criminal history. Let's analyze it carefully, line by line. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans. The opening is immediately theatrical. Esteemed mortal positions the writer as something other than mortal, supernatural, superior. It sets a tone of arrogance and otherness. They have never caught me and they never will. A direct taunt to law enforcement. This kind of arrogance is common in letters from serial killers. The Zodiac Killer made similar claims. It reflects a grandiose personality, someone who feels intellectually superior to authorities. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. The claim of invisibility is interesting. On one level, it's literally true, no one had clearly seen the Axeman's face. On another level, it suggests the killer believes he moves through society unnoticed, perhaps hiding in plain sight. The reference to ether is a nod to early 20th century scientific language. Ether was believed to be an invisible substance that permeated space. This suggests the writer was educated enough to know contemporary scientific theories. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. This is where the letter becomes truly strange. Is the writer genuinely delusional, believing he's a demon? Or is this theatrical performance, the killer adopting a persona to frighten people and mock police? Most modern analysts believe it's the latter, a conscious theatrical choice rather than genuine delusion. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. Note that the writer doesn't self-identify as the Axeman. He's acknowledging that's what others call him, but he's setting himself apart from that label. The adjective foolish again mocks police, suggesting superiority. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. A threat of future violence. But note the phrasing, when I see fit. This suggests control, planning, intentionality. Not a crazed killer acting on impulse, but someone who carefully chooses when to strike. I alone know whom they shall be. This is either, A, true, the killer alone knows who he'll target, or B, a bluff, the killer himself doesn't know because he chooses randomly. Either way, it emphasizes the killer's power and control. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. Besmeared is an archaic, almost biblical word choice. It suggests someone educated, someone who reads literature or religious texts. The phrase, sent below to keep me company, reinforces the demon persona. He's sending victims to hell where he resides. If you wish you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Another taunt. The writer is telling the public to warn the police on his behalf. It's a power play, positioning himself as too important to speak directly to police, like a king issuing proclamations through messengers. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. The juxtaposition of reasonable with claims of being a demon is darkly humorous. It suggests the writer has a sense of irony, possibly even humor about his crimes. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. More mockery. He's, graciously, not being offended by police failures. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. Francis Joseph is a curious reference. Franz Joseph I was the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, who had died in 1916. Why reference him here as part of a satanic court? Some historians speculate this might be a clue to the writer's background, perhaps someone with Austro-Hungarian connections? Or it might be random, meaningless theatrical flourish. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. A threat wrapped in dramatic language. It were better that they were never born, is biblical phrasing, echoing passages like Matthew 26 verse 24. Again, this suggests someone familiar with religious language and literature. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. The sarcasm here is biting. He's saying the police will dodge him, implying they're avoiding him, running scared, not because they're clever but because they're cowardly. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Dripping with sarcasm. Calling the police wise while implying they're actually incompetent. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. An admission, yes, I'm a murderer. But immediately followed by, I'm being merciful. I could kill more if I wanted. This is about control. He's choosing the pace and scale of violence, emphasizing his power. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Grandiose claims of power. The parenthetical, and the worst, is interesting. It suggests the writer doesn't discriminate, doesn't care about the moral character of victims. Angel of death, continues the supernatural/religious imagery. Now, to be exact, at 12:15, earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. The specificity is striking, 12:15 a.m., Tuesday, March 19th. Why that precise time? Some have speculated it might have personal significance to the killer. Others think it's random, chosen just to create a specific deadline for drama. Earthly time reinforces the idea that he exists outside normal human existence. Passover echoes biblical language about the angel of death passing over homes in Exodus. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Infinite mercy is grandiose language, positioning himself as a godlike figure dispensing grace. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. This is the heart of the letter, the famous jazz ultimatum. Why jazz? New Orleans was the birthplace of jazz, which was still a relatively new musical form in 1919. Jazz was associated with African American culture, with sin, with nightlife and drinking. Respectable white society often looked down on jazz as immoral. By demanding jazz, the writer is celebrating something that represents New Orleans uniquely. Possibly making a statement about race and class, forcing respectable white families to play black music. Creating an absurd, theatrical scenario. Ensuring his letter would be talked about and remembered. The specificity, in full swing, creates a vivid image. He's not just asking for jazz to be played quietly. He wants it loud, energetic, impossible to ignore. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. He's presenting this as a citywide participation event. Not just individual protection, but collective action. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The threat is clear and specific. Jazz it out is colloquial language, suggesting someone familiar with local slang. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Tartarus is the deepest part of the Greek underworld, where the wicked are punished. The writer is claiming it as his native home, reinforcing the demon persona. Cease my discourse is formal, educated language. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am and will be the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fancy. Thou wilt and thee are archaic English, evoking biblical or Shakespearean language. The final claim, the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fancy, is maximally grandiose. He's claiming to be worse than any actual or fictional demon in history. The Axeman. The signature is simple, direct, accepting the name given to him by the public. What can we conclude about the letter's author? 1. Educated. The writer demonstrates knowledge of classical references, Tartarus. Historical references, Franz Joseph. Biblical language and themes. Sophisticated vocabulary. Varied sentence structures. This wasn't written by someone uneducated or illiterate. 2. Theatrical. The entire letter is performance. The demon persona. The dramatic language. The jazz ultimatum. The specific timing. The writer is creating theater, turning murder into spectacle. 3. Mocking authority. Throughout the letter, police are mocked, belittled, taunted. This suggests deep contempt for authority, possibly rooted in feelings of intellectual superiority. 4. Local knowledge. References to Orleanians, jazz, and local culture suggest someone deeply familiar with New Orleans. 5. Possible motive hints. The emphasis on jazz, a musical form associated with black culture, might suggest the killer was making a statement about race and culture. Or the killer simply loved jazz and wanted to hear it. Or it was random, theatrical choice with no deep meaning. We can't know for certain. Is it genuine? The biggest question, did the real Axeman write this letter, or was it a hoax? Arguments it was genuine. The attack stopped on March 19 as promised. The letter demonstrates knowledge of the crimes. The tone of superiority matches the behavior of other serial killers who've written to media. Arguments it was a hoax. The theatrical tone might be someone capitalizing on the fear for attention. The jazz element seems too absurd to be real. Superintendent Mooney believed it was fake. No subsequent letters were received, unlike Zodiac, who wrote many letters. Most modern analysts believe the letter was probably genuine, written by the actual killer. The fact that no attacks occurred on March 19 suggests the writer had the ability to control when attacks happened, which only the real killer would have. But we'll never know with absolute certainty. After October 1919, the Axeman vanished. No more attacks. No more letters. Nothing. Where did he go? What happened to him? Let's examine the possibilities. Theory 1, he died. The Spanish flu pandemic was still active in late 1919. Perhaps the Axeman contracted the flu and died. Thousands of people died during the pandemic, many in unmarked graves or mass burials. If the Axeman died without family or identification, his identity would have been lost forever. This would explain the sudden cessation of attacks. Supporting evidence. The timing aligns, flu was still killing people in fall 1919. Sudden stops in serial killer activity often indicate the killer's death. No similar attacks occurred in New Orleans after 1919. Problems. No unidentified bodies from that period match likely age/description. Seems too convenient. If he died, why were there no deathbed confessions or posthumous discoveries of evidence? Theory 2, he left New Orleans. Perhaps the Axeman simply moved to another city and either A. stopped killing entirely, or B. continued killing using different methods. Supporting evidence. Serial killers often move between hunting grounds. The increased police presence and public awareness might have made New Orleans too risky. Some analysts believe similar axe attacks in other cities in the 1920s might be connected, though never proven. Problems. No similar attacks with the same MO have been definitively identified elsewhere. If he moved and continued killing, why change methods entirely? The theatrical nature, jazz letter, suggests someone with a specific connection to New Orleans. Theory 3, he was arrested for another crime. Perhaps the Axeman was arrested or institutionalized for an unrelated crime or due to mental illness. This would explain why the attack stopped. He was incarcerated or hospitalized. Supporting evidence. Many serial killers are caught for unrelated offenses. Mental institutions in the 1920s were overwhelmed and poorly documented. If the Axeman had been acting on delusional beliefs, he might have eventually had a psychotic break that led to institutionalization. Problems. No arrest records from that period matched the likely profile. Fingerprints and photos weren't routinely taken of all arrestees or institutionalized patients. If he was arrested and eventually released, why didn't attacks resume? Theory 4, he stopped by choice. Some serial killers do stop killing. BTK, Dennis Rader, stopped for years, then resumed, then stopped again. The Zodiac Killer stopped confirmed murders in 1969. Others have stopped when they gained control of their compulsions, found other outlets, or simply aged out of their violent period. Perhaps the Axeman stopped by choice. Supporting evidence. The letter suggests someone with control and planning ability. He demonstrated he could wait months between attacks. If he had that much control, he might have been able to stop entirely. Problems. It's rare for serial killers to stop permanently on their own. Most who stop either die, are caught, or are incapacitated. The compulsion typically doesn't just disappear. Theory 5, Joseph Mumfre was the Axeman, and Esther Pepitone's revenge ended his killing. This is the theory many people believe. According to this scenario, Joseph Mumfre was the Axeman. He fled New Orleans after the Pepitone murder in September 1919. He moved to Los Angeles. Esther tracked him down and killed him in December 1920. This ended his reign of terror. Supporting evidence. Mumfre's jail time coincides with the gap in attacks. He left New Orleans when the attacks stopped. Esther's identification, while possibly motivated by revenge, might have been accurate. His criminal history included violence and burglary. The timeline is almost perfect. Problems. Esther's identification came over a year after the attack, when memories fade. She only saw the killer briefly in darkness. No physical evidence linked Mumfre to any crime scene. His criminal record doesn't suggest the theatrical personality that wrote the jazz letter. Grief and trauma might have made Esther see what she wanted to see, a target for her rage. Theory 6, he was killed by someone else. Perhaps the Axeman was killed by a victim who fought back, though no such incident was reported. A vigilante or mob justice, Italian community members seeking revenge. An unrelated crime or accident. If his body was disposed of or never identified, his death would explain the sudden stop. Supporting evidence. Vigilante justice was common in 1919 New Orleans. Italian community members were angry and armed. If the killer was someone local, someone might have recognized him and taken matters into their own hands. Problems. No rumors or stories about vigilante justice in this case. Hard to keep such a killing secret for over 100 years. No deathbed confessions or family stories about, "My grandfather killed the Axeman." Theory 7, the attacks weren't all by the same person. A minority theory suggests the Axeman was actually multiple killers. Some attacks were genuine Axeman crimes. Others were copycat attacks or unrelated crimes attributed to him. The real Axeman might have only killed 1 to 2 victims, with others being imitations. Supporting evidence. Some attacks had slightly different patterns. Sarah Laumann's attack came through a window, not a chiseled door. The long gaps between attacks could indicate different perpetrators. The jazz letter might have been a hoax by someone unconnected to the murders. Problems. The core pattern is too consistent: chiseled doors, victims' own axes, no theft, similar brutality. Occam's razor suggests one killer rather than multiple coincidentally using the same method. Most analysts reject this theory. What likely happened? Based on all available evidence, here's the most probable scenario. The Axeman was a single individual who committed all or most of the attacks between 1918 to 1919. He was likely a local man, familiar with New Orleans. Mentally ill, possibly psychotic, but still highly functional. Strong, intelligent, and disciplined. Someone who wrote the jazz letter, genuine, not a hoax. He stopped attacking in October 1919 because he died, illness, accident, or violence. He was arrested/institutionalized for another reason. He left New Orleans permanently. Or some combination of the above. Joseph Mumfre is the most likely suspect, though the evidence is circumstantial. If Mumfre was the Axeman, then Esther Pepitone's revenge killing in 1920 ended his life and closed the case unofficially. But we'll never know with certainty. The Axeman's identity remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American crime. Over 105 years have passed since the Axeman first struck New Orleans. Everyone who lived through those terrifying months is now dead. The victims. The witnesses. The police who investigated. Even the children who heard their parents' fearful whispers. All gone. What remains is the mystery. And the question: why does this case still fascinate us? The elements of enduring mysteries. The Axeman case has all the elements that keep cold cases alive in public consciousness. 1. A clear villain. Unlike cases where we're not even sure a crime occurred, the Axeman was undeniably real. Multiple victims. Multiple witnesses. Physical evidence. There's no ambiguity about whether the crimes happened. 2. Dramatic flair. The jazz letter elevates this from a simple murder case to something almost mythological. A killer who writes to newspapers and makes the entire city dance. It's the stuff of fiction, except it's real. 3. Never solved. Cases that end with arrests and trials fade from memory. Unsolved cases linger, each generation trying to solve what previous generations couldn't. 4. Relatable terror. The Axeman invaded homes, the place people should feel safest. This creates a primal fear that resonates across time and culture. Anyone with a home can imagine the horror of the Axeman coming through their door. 5. Historical context. The case occurred during a fascinating period: post-World War I America, the birth of jazz, the flu pandemic, Prohibition era approaching. It's a window into a lost world. The lessons. What can modern investigators learn from the Axeman case? 1. Preserve everything. Evidence that seems insignificant at the time might become crucial later as technology advances. The Axeman case lost valuable evidence because investigators didn't recognize its potential importance. 2. Look for patterns early. The Maggio and Besumer attacks weren't immediately connected. If police had recognized the pattern sooner, they might have prevented later attacks. 3. Take witnesses seriously. Some witness statements were dismissed or not followed up properly. Every witness matters, even if their information seems minor. 4. Consider uncommon profiles. Police focused on the mafia theory because it fit their understanding of crime. They struggled to comprehend a serial killer operating without rational motives. Modern investigators know to consider psychological profiles, not just traditional criminal motives. 5. Document everything. Many records from the Axeman case have been lost or were never created. Comprehensive documentation ensures future investigators can review the case with fresh eyes. Could this case still be solved? In theory, yes. But practically, probably not. What would it take to solve the Axeman case today? Scenario 1: Discovery of new evidence. Perhaps somewhere in an attic or archive, a box of documents exists. Letters from the Axeman that were never published. Police notes that went missing. A confession written by the killer before his death. Family documents from Joseph Mumfre or another suspect. Such discoveries have solved old cases before. But after 105 years, most evidence has been destroyed, lost, or deteriorated beyond usefulness. Scenario 2: Genealogical research. If any biological evidence exists, hair, blood, and if it's been properly preserved, genetic genealogy might identify the killer. But this requires evidence to still exist, unlikely after 105 years. Evidence to be properly stored, unlikely given 1918 evidence handling. Evidence to belong to the killer, not victims or contamination, difficult to determine. The chances are essentially zero. Scenario 3: Historical research. A dedicated historian or researcher might uncover new information. Prison records that place a specific individual in jail during the gap in attacks. Immigration records that show someone leaving New Orleans in 1919. Newspaper articles that were never digitized. Family oral histories that match the case details. This is the most likely path to new information, though it's unlikely to definitively solve the case. Scenario 4: Confession from descendant. Perhaps a descendant of the Axeman knows the truth, a family secret passed down through generations. Deathbed confessions from elderly relatives sometimes solve cold cases. But after 105 years, even this becomes unlikely. The reality: the Axeman case will almost certainly never be officially solved. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence has been lost. The people involved are all dead. We're left with theories, educated guesses, and circumstantial evidence. Joseph Mumfre remains the most likely suspect, but we can't prove it. The case will remain forever in the realm of probably and possibly, never reaching the certainty of definitely. And perhaps that's fitting. New Orleans has always been a city of mysteries, ghost stories, voodoo legends, unsolved disappearances. The Axeman fits perfectly into that tradition. A figure who emerged from the darkness, terrorized the city, made everyone dance to his tune, and then vanished like smoke. It's the kind of story that feels like it shouldn't be real. But it is. The victims were real. Their families' suffering was real. The fear was real. And somewhere in New Orleans' past, the Axeman was real. We just don't know who he was. On March 19, 1919, the entire city of New Orleans danced. Rich and poor. Black and white. Native-born and immigrant. All united by fear, all moving to the rhythm of jazz. For one night, a serial killer's threat transformed into the biggest party the city had ever seen. And for one night, no one died. Perhaps the Axeman kept his promise. Or perhaps the collective act of defiance, turning terror into celebration, protected the city through sheer force of will. We'll never know. What we do know is this. The Axeman of New Orleans killed at least 6 people and injured many more. He terrified an entire city for over a year. He wrote one of the most bizarre letters in criminal history. And then he disappeared, his identity lost to time. Was he Joseph Mumfre, killed by Esther Pepitone's revenge? Was he an unknown veteran, his mind broken by war? Was he a madman who died in the flu pandemic? Or was he something else entirely, something we haven't even considered? After 105 years, the mystery endures. The Axeman's identity remains unknown. But his legacy lives on. In the jazz music that still fills New Orleans streets. In the true crime documentaries and books that analyze his crimes. In the historians who still search for answers. And in the reminder that sometimes, even with all our technology and knowledge, some mysteries remain unsolved. The Axeman of New Orleans. He came from nowhere. He killed without clear motive. He made a city dance. And then he vanished into the darkness from which he came. Leaving behind only questions, theories, and the haunting echo of jazz music playing in the New Orleans night. This is Cold Case Dossier, file number 003. The Axeman of New Orleans. Unsolved. Unforgotten. And still dancing in the shadows of history. The Axeman of New Orleans is one of the most bizarre unsolved cases in American history. A serial killer who wrote letters claiming to be a demon. Who made an entire city play jazz to save their lives. And who vanished without ever being caught. Over 105 years later, we still don't know who he was. If this case fascinated you, here's how you can help keep history alive. Hit that like button, it tells YouTube to share this story with more people who love true crime history. Subscribe to Cold Case Dossier for more deep dives into the cases that time forgot but justice still demands. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Comment below, have you heard of the Axeman before? What's your theory? Do you think Joseph Mumfre was the killer? Share this video with anyone who loves true crime, jazz history, or New Orleans culture. The Axeman's story deserves to be remembered, not just as a mystery, but as a reminder of the real people who suffered, the city that lived in fear, and the one magical night when music brought everyone together. Next week on Cold Case Dossier, we'll investigate another case from America's past, another killer who was never caught, another family still seeking answers, another mystery waiting to be explored. Until then, remember, history's darkest moments teach us the most about human nature, both its cruelty and its resilience. The Axeman killed, but New Orleans survived. He threatened, but the city danced. And that defiance, that refusal to let fear win, is the real legacy of March 19, 1919. For the victims of the Axeman, for the city that survived him, and for everyone who still searches for truth in the shadows of history. This is Cold Case Dossier. Stay curious. Stay compassionate. And keep the music playing.